my name's Nicole Hewlett. As Mel was saying, I'm a proud Palawa woman from the Trawita, Tasmania, from the Nunoni bloodlines of the southeast coast. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands, the Larrakia people, and recognise that this place has been a place of sharing stories and knowledge since the dawn. And it's a privilege to be on this country, and you can feel the spirits of this country as soon as you land. So it's always such a beautiful experience, particularly for the Palawa people to come here, because traditionally we're so far away. We, historically wouldn't have had much contact with the Larrakia people. So thank you for welcoming us, and we hope that today the stories that we share from this book and from Peter's giant brain will also, invite your stories. So today it's not so much a flash presentation, but it's more of a yarn that we want to have around what's in the book, and also provide that and extend that invitation for people to share what resonates with them around what's come up from the last 50 years of alcohol policies. What have we learnt? What haven't we learnt? Which is probably something that attracted me to the book, because I feel like we're a bit of an odd couple that's come together in this world. But spirit weaves as spirit wills. So we met at Menzies School of Health Research, and obviously Dabs saw how cool I was, so he thought, I want that in the book. And obviously Dabs has got lots of knowledge that I have, grown immensely from throughout the journey of this book. And is there anything else you want to add around that, and introduce probably yourself?
Well, I actually feel like just walking out the door after all this sort of, or I should just claim guru status, that I've, got this fantastic knowledge and if only. Yeah, look, thank you. We're going to, as Nick has intimated, we're going to, rather than get up and sort of give a lecture for an hour, which we think would be fairly boring, we're going to try to have a conversation about the book. I just want to say very briefly that I too want to pay my respects to the Larrakia people, and I guess echo the very moving introduction or the very moving welcome that Janine gave at the beginning of this conference. Shall we fire away and start talking about the book instead of...
And it's also important to acknowledge that because we're talking of stories from the past 50 years, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to do be careful with your spirits. There are images of people that have passed in the presentation, so just being mindful of that. But shall I begin my clicky goodness? Right. How did you fall into the alcohol space?
Yeah, well, it was completely accidental, but yes, it was back in the 1980s when I was engaged to do some research for the then Northern Territory government about the restricted areas legislation, or the restricted areas provisions of the Northern Territory Liquor Act, which were at the time, and I think have remained actually, a fairly progressive piece of legislation, even though they've been overlaid by some not very progressive pieces of legislation since then. But the restricted areas provisions were designed to enable Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory to allow or not allow alcohol into those communities. I think they were it was the first legislation in Australia to enable this to happen. But even then, there were interesting currents, because while some people in the government were very in favour of this, others were actually trying to undermine it, because they thought it will encourage Aboriginal people to come to town and drink. So this is a very familiar theme, of course, which still goes through today. Anyway, I did some research on this, and then embarrassingly quickly was regarded as an expert in the area. And that's the sort of, I think I was smart enough to realise that I wasn't an expert at all, and doing this book has, brought home, that I didn't know as much as I thought I did know in some areas. But anyway, enough about us. Let's
We'll begin with the first story that I think lays the context of alcohol with regards to our people. And I just want to read out this newspaper article from the Northern Territory News in 1964. So it's titled, "Police Pulled Man Out of Bed, Court is Told." So a welfare officer said in the Darwin Police Court today that a native had been pulled out of bed, charged with drinking liquor and put in the cells last night. The officer, Mr. Ted Harvey, was speaking for Aboriginal Bobby Turner of Bagot. Mr. Harvey said it was true that a call had gone out from Bagot to the police station, but that it was some considerable time before the police arrived. In the meantime, Bobby Turner had returned to his hut and gone to bed. He had slept for some time when police pulled him out of his bed and arrested him. Mr. Harvey said Turner admitted he had been drinking and was under the influence. But he wasn't causing a disturbance or annoying anybody, Mr. Harvey said. No doubt he had the appearance of being drunk when the police woke him, with combined effects of a hangover and sleep. Scanning Turner's lengthy record, Mr. Leader SM commented this must be one of the worst records of liquor offences on the police files. He sentenced Turner to 14 days jail. So, Dabs, being the storyteller that you are, what do you take from the story and the placement of that story in this newspaper article?
The reason that this story caught my attention some time ago is that, as I say, we're going back 60 years to see an Aboriginal man has been put into jail for 14 days, not actually for drinking. He's not observed drinking. He's apparently been drinking, which was illegal in those days for an Aboriginal person to possess or consume alcohol. He's been thrown into jail for 14 days. But there's another story there on the right-hand side, which is the advertisement for Victoria Bitter, a beer that's really beer. And you see there the lean, suntanned, white Australian man. This is the other side of alcohol in the Northern Territory, a celebrated culture with the sort of economic backing behind it. So you see here juxtaposed the almost romanticised image of white drinking with the reliance on policing of Aboriginal drinking. Now that all took place in 1964. About less than 2 months after this episode occurred, the prohibition on Aboriginal drinking was lifted. So 2 months later, he could not have been put in jail for that. He was legally entitled to drink as much as, you know, the lean white man. So that's the historical context in which a lot of what's happened since. And it would be interesting to reflect, we don't have time to do it, on how much has actually changed since then, in the last 60 years. But at any rate, that's the context of a century of prohibition was suddenly ended in 1964, in May 1964, and then Aboriginal people were given access to alcohol after all this period of prohibition, and then if you like, the issues started to emerge, and that's the context in which drinking came in as an issue, and in which the book, if you like, started. Yeah.
Oh, this is my favourite. I walked in on Dabs, who was supposed to be heavily into building the presentation, and I just see all these elephants up on his screen, and I said, "Are you doing the presentation?" He's like, "I haven't got as far as I like." As he's trying to spend, I don't know how long he spent trying to find the perfect elephant for this slide. Anyway, we got there. There is your elephant, but please feel free to describe why we have an elephant on the slide.
Oh, so I get to tell the story.
You get to tell the parable.
All right, well, I suppose we haven't really explained quite enough about why the book. The book that we've prepared and that was to have been launched tomorrow, but we've had a few delays with the publisher. The publisher is a multinational corporation that has an editorial office in Singapore and a production in Chennai in India. And we keep getting these stories out of Chennai that, no, we're running a bit late. We finally got the page proofs on Saturday night. So the book is not ready to actually launch tomorrow as we'd planned. We have, however, put a flyer out. But I guess the book came, from my point of view, I was looking back over this period of 50 years and saying, well, a lot of things have been tried in dealing with alcohol. Some things have worked in some places. Some things probably haven't worked. But there's a real danger that the lessons to be learned are kind of drifting out the door, especially in this digital era when, you know, if anything is more than a year old, it's out of date. So we cast around for some funding to enable this to happen, and bless them, the Northern Territory Primary Health Network came to our rescue and funded the project. And I'd like to actually acknowledge Amanda Davies, who's over here, who played a big part in making that happen when she was with NTPHN. Anyway, so that's the book. But the book starts with looking at the different ways in which Aboriginal alcohol use has been thought about and talked about and used as an approach for programs and policies. And my mind went back to a famous old story of the elephant. This is an old story out of Buddhist literature about a bunch of blind men. I think they're all men. It was a fairly sort of, you know, patriarchal system, I think. A bunch of blind men are asked to describe an elephant. So they go in and they all touch different parts of the elephant and they're asked to describe. And so one touches the tusks of the elephant and says, oh, I think the elephant is this hard sort of ivory-like substance, and somebody else grabs the tail and says, oh, I think it's a sort of a ropey sort of... Anyway, so we use this image to talk about, over the years, all the different ways in which Aboriginal alcohol use has been thought about. So the first, of course, was a century of prohibition. The assumption underlying policies was that Aboriginal people were incapable of drinking responsibly, whatever that was thought to be, and also that if Aboriginal people got access to alcohol, this would upset the colonial social order. You know, there would be spatial boundaries would be threatened, sexual boundaries would be threatened. No, we can't have it. So there was prohibition, which lasted the best part of 100 years. And that was linked to a belief that has floated around and probably never quite gone away, that actually there might be some sort of race-based difference in how Aboriginal people metabolize, deal with alcohol compared to other people. And without, again, going into it, there is no evidence to support any such differences. There's been a very limited amount of research which did not support it. It would probably be a bold statement to say categorically there are no differences, because frankly the adequate research hasn't been done. But the point is that, is there evidence of some sort of racially based difference? No. Another way of looking, which has been a very important way of looking at alcohol, is alcoholism. And I obviously don't need to tell anybody here what's meant by that term, is a disease. Now, the notion that it is some kind of a disease, as I'm sure you're all aware, really, well, it actually wasn't invented by AA. Sometimes people think that it started with AA. That's not true. It's actually got a much older history. But it was certainly given a lot of credence through AA. And as you'd all be aware, it's been a very important part of treatment approaches for Aboriginal people with alcohol problems for a long time. But with the added notion that we'll talk a little bit about later on, that it's not so much a physical disease, it's as much a spiritual disease as a physical disease. So that's certainly been an important approach. And that in turn is linked to psychological explanations which talk about Aboriginal alcohol use as a kind of psychological response to marginalisation and discrimination. Again, it's been the public health approach, which really came in from the 1970s and does have important differences. And I guess the main difference is that the public health approach invites us to look not at individual drinking or drinking by individuals, but drinking at the level of the population itself, and also places quite a lot of emphasis on managing supply as well as managing demand. Another view that has been very influential is that alcohol problems are essentially a symptom of colonisation, and that's a very shorthand term for a lot of other processes. But that also has engendered critiques, and in particular, a number of prominent Aboriginal people, notably, I suppose, Marcia Langton and Noel Pearson, actually took issue with what they called symptom theory and said, yes, of course, current alcohol use is a product of historical processes, but it has become a problem in its own right, and you have to treat it as a problem in its own right, not simply as a symptom of other problems. Okay, and that's, again, an important and possibly increasingly important view of alcohol issues as products of intergenerational unresolved trauma. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so another view, which is, I don't know how much influence it had, it's hard to say, is that like a lot of other health issues, it needs to be understood in terms of what are called the social determinants of health. So you need to look at things like housing, employment, education, if you're going to make any serious inroads into the particular issue you're concerned with, which in this case is alcohol issues. So I think it's important, we don't want to say too much about all that, but it is important to recognise that all of these different approaches lead to different ways of thinking about the issue and different kinds of policies and programs.
And that's largely what I suppose informs the book, is looking at all of these different approaches, blending them together and understanding what the impact, what the evidence says about different approaches in terms of what works and what doesn't work. We won't go through every chapter of the book because you'll end up crying by the end, but we will go through and give you a flavour of certain chapters that might resonate and be useful today. And one of the chapters is, of course, around prevention and early intervention. And we invite everyone, again, to add stories, to share experiences or opinion or insights or ask questions. Dabs has been around for a bit and he remembers, you know, the context at the time. And it's one thing that I've said to Dabs before is you have this amazing ability to not only remember what happened at certain periods of time, but not just take in the information of what supports your beliefs. He took in the understandings of all sides of decision making at the time. And I think that's an incredible gift that we have access to today. So in terms of early intervention and prevention, what do we mean by that in the context of alcohol?
Okay, my head is now swelling. I'm so okay, so a part of the book deals with prevention and early intervention, and historically, of course, that's actually been the early intervention has been the neglected side of approaches to Aboriginal alcohol problems. There's been a historical emphasis on primary prevention, that is things like media campaigns, education campaigns. There's been a heavy emphasis on residential treatment and rehabilitation, but the gap for a long time was in secondary prevention and early intervention. With the primary prevention, there's actually very little evidence of effectiveness of these programs, although we've got to be a bit careful there because that's often a product of either no evaluation or inadequate evaluation rather than problems of the programs themselves. But in terms of what does the evidence suggest about the most effective primary prevention, and Kylie Lee, who's here today, has done quite a lot of work in this area, and as she and others have shown, is there are a number of probably important components of success. Certainly the first one is a high level of community involvement. There need to be multiple components. There is a very important role for promoting cultural connectivity, and that's an umbrella term that of course can cover a lot of different specifics. And the importance of practical skills development. All right, but we want to go on and talk a little bit more about secondary prevention, which, as I've said, was the neglected area for a long time. But as some of you would be well aware, certainly over the last probably 10 to 20 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on trying to get more early intervention into primary healthcare settings, partly because, well, for a number of reasons, but one is that people with alcohol problems are actually more likely to wind up in primary healthcare settings than in treatment programs. There is a context there where people expect to be given advice and are more likely to accept, or at least to allow that advice to be given. The advice is personalised. Health professionals are expected to give advice. And often the advice given can provide a kind of an external justification for somebody who is trying to give up alcohol but's been humbugged by, or to cut down their drinking, but is being humbugged by, you know, family and friends to not do so. So there is a lot of evidence that timely early intervention can be very effective. The problems, however, are, and we'll perhaps go on to the next.
Well, I was just going to add in there, so we've got primary health settings. Would you say that applies as well to Aboriginal health settings though?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Oh yes, I mean, I think that's, and thanks for, yes, when I say primary health settings, I mean, Aboriginal community controlled health are by far and away the most important probably in providing this.
Yes. And would you say that these, well, what are the, I suppose, the challenges of things like, say, the audit screening tool or brief intervention in places like our Aboriginal medical services?
Well, again, there has been some useful work done in recent years, that there are a number of key barriers, because what's been found both in Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal settings is that, yes, everybody says it's a good idea, but actually it's pretty hard to get people to do it. Why is that so? There's a couple of barriers that actually arise out of, if you like, the nature of Aboriginal drinking. One is the episodic nature, that if you ask somebody what's the typical amount they drink, well, if they go for several weeks without drinking anything and then have a binge and then go several more weeks, what is a typical amount? It's almost a meaningless concept. So a lot of these early intervention tools are actually based around a regular drinking pattern, which is not applicable. And the other issue is that a lot of drinking takes place in a group setting, and it's pretty well impossible for an individual to work out how much they as an individual consumed if they were one of 6 or 8 people who consumed, you know, a couple of cartons or whatever it is. I mean, you can work it out mathematically, but nonetheless, you know, drinking is not so much an individualised behaviour. So that presents problems for using some of these mainstream approaches. There are also barriers such as the time pressures that people feel, or it's not their core business. A health practitioner says it's not my core business. There is scepticism about the effectiveness of these interventions, or there may be a feeling that, well, what are the referral options anyway? And there is another concern that maybe I'll open up another can of worms. If I start asking somebody about their drinking, I might start uncovering a whole lot of issues that I don't have the time or the knowledge to deal with. So there are real barriers, but there are steps, I think, being taken to try to adapt screening tools, create a more supportive environment for this important work to proceed.
And this brings us to another chapter we have in the book around treatment and rehabilitation. And Val Bright was really one of the pioneers in this space. Do you want to give a little bit of context on why and how she left such a legacy?
Yeah, very briefly. Yeah, Val Bryant was a giant in this area. In 1974, she opened. She was a New South Wales. It's a term. I don't even know how to pronounce it properly. It's somebody can correct me, perhaps. A Gumbaynggirr woman. Am I saying it? It's sorry. Gumbaynggirr. She was a Gumbaynggirr woman who, in 1974, pretty much off her own bat, with not too much by way of resources, actually opened a treatment facility in Sydney initially, and then within a couple of years moved it up to a place outside Kempsey, which had its own curious history. It had actually been a boys' home for stolen generation boys, but that had ceased. She started up what became known as Bennelong's Haven, the first treatment facility in Australia. And somewhere along the line, she teamed up with Jim Carroll, who she married. They became a couple. But the treatment facility that they started really became the model for other programs right around Australia, including some here. And certainly Forward was modelled on, I don't know about CAPS actually. I think it might have come later. But anyway, Bennelong's Haven became the sort of model treatment, the dominant form of treatment. It was based on AA and the disease notion, but she insisted on two important differences. She said, first of all, amongst Aboriginal people drinking as a group, she said literally, Aboriginal people get drunk in groups, they get sober in groups. She didn't mince her words. And she also stressed this notion of as a spiritual disease. But they, as I say, her approach became very much the model throughout Australia for quite a long time, and still is very, very important.
But you've said that previously, it has attracted some criticism. Why? Why has that attracted?
Okay. So yes, I mean, governments became uneasy about funding a lot of these programs because they were not convinced that they were having good results. There are a number of criticisms leveled. One is that the AA approach offers a very narrow range of treatment options. Abstinence is seen as the only option, so that other forms that may work for some people were not given sufficient attention. And the other concern was that a lot of these programs, these services were structurally very isolated. They weren't sort of linked into the broader world of alcohol and other drug prevention and treatment, and there were management issues. So there was a push for more preventative early intervention programs, and that's a continuing tension, if you like, to this day.
And further on in the same chapter around treatment and rehabilitation, we talk, which is probably an area that I'm most passionate about, around embedding culture and healing in these approaches. Do you want to talk about how that has been done in the past?
Yeah, the emphasis on healing and cultural healing actually probably started more in the United States in the context of Native American treatment programs, where a view grew up that basically Western biomedical approaches were not adequate for dealing with the kind of intergenerational trauma that was driving a lot of the alcohol issues amongst Aboriginal people. And secondly, that traditional healing practices actually did have a lot of alternatives that were more suited to these particular issues. So again, probably from the 1990s in Australia, we saw people like Judy Atkinson, who developed the Wayali program in the 1990s in Rockhampton initially, and that's gone on to become, it's got much bigger and in fact, as that second part of that slide shows, another stream of this is this notion of dadiri, which I'm sure people here would be familiar with. It's a very hard notion to just sum up quickly.
Well, I think it's the DD is And I would imagine that a lot of you have done that training. Auntie Miriam Rose and Lebert from Daily Rhythm in the Northern Territory. So it's a mindfulness practice and a deep listening and still awareness. I go into a little bit more in my presentation, but yeah, it's an ancient wisdom and practice that Arnie had gifted to all Australians for insight and contemplation.
Yeah, so now you can do an online course in DRDD. I don't know, I'm having difficulty getting my head around the notion of doing an online course in that, but anyway, that is an option there, as you can see. But then I guess another area that we touch upon are the recent efforts, particularly out of New South Wales, to try to bring together culturally based healing programs with, in a more sort of Western sense, evidence-based therapies. So there has been some interesting work, which we're not going to have time to talk about today, done in trying to bring those together in a collaborative project with a number of treatment facilities in New South Wales, which also provides a mechanism for ongoing monitoring and evaluation, because that remains a sort of critical area, which, again, we talk about a little bit about the book, this issue about, all right, well, what does it mean to evaluate a program? Because there are, evaluation is a very culturally specific notion as well. So there's some interesting work going on trying to bring together these different worldviews, different understandings of healing, different understandings of evidence, summarised there in that diagram, which is taken from one of these projects. To really switch around to another area which has been important and to this day continues to be both important and contentious, and that's this whole notion that you deal with alcohol problems by restricting availability. In the book, we trace that back to the origins in Australia in the late 1980s, when particularly in Central Australia, there were very large mobilisations led by women from the NPY lands, who felt that until the suppliers of alcohol were brought under control, nothing was going to, the carnage that was going on in those days to do with alcohol, that you had to do something about the suppliers. And that photograph there is an NPY photograph, which they've given us permission to use, is actually one of the first rallies. That was 1989, when about 300 women, I'm not sure they were all women actually, but they were certainly led by women, gathered to demand that Curtin Springs Roadhouse stop selling takeaway alcohol to Aboriginal people. And that was a 10-year campaign, which we talk about a little bit in the book. They finally succeeded. That was then in the mid-90s in Tennant Creek, you had the Jalalakari Association led a campaign to have restrictions on takeaway sales in particular, introduced there. And Alexis Wright, who's a very well-known Aboriginal writer, she actually wrote a marvellous account of that in her book Grog War, which I can recommend to. So both of those were very much community-driven exercises in controlling availability. But there's another side to controlling availability, which is much more the top-down approach. On that bottom right-hand side, you'll see there, in the year 2000, around the year 2000, the Queensland government imposed restrictions on Aboriginal communities in Cape York and also beyond Cape York in Queensland, 19 communities. And they played a curious game because they said these all have to be community-based and community-based alcohol management plans. But in fact, the government was controlling very much what you could and couldn't do. So it became very much more a top-down exercise in controlling availability. And then, of course, a more spectacular example of that was the intervention in 2007, which I don't think we need to elaborate on here. So you've got these two sides of controlling availability, the sort of bottom-up, community-driven, and the top down, and a lot of the tensions around that are playing out to this day, particularly in Alice Springs, as you all know. So I guess the only thing to say there, though, or not the only thing, but an important thing to say, is that where they are community-driven, there is a very high evidence of success. They don't solve all problems. And yes, of course, some people go elsewhere and drink. But the level of harms actually can be shown to drop. And despite what you'd be sometimes led to believe, they generally have very widespread community support. We talk a bit in the book about this other way of trying to manage alcohol access through licensed clubs in communities. The aspiration behind licensed clubs, of course, is that you'll have moderate drinking done in the community instead of uncontrolled drinking on the fringes of towns, that the profits will stay in the community instead of going to the vendors, and thirdly, that you'll get rid of grog running and people going into town to get drink. Now, the very short answer is that yes, all those things can happen, but they usually don't. Most communities actually don't want clubs, despite, the politicians frequently say, oh, those communities have a right to clubs, and yes, they know they have the right and they don't want them. But there are some that do, and there are a few that, probably achieve their objectives. But they're damn hard to manage. They put enormous burdens on the community, and generally they get inadequate support. However, where there is strong community support, where there is going to be support for actually managing them, yes, they certainly are an option, but not a simple option. And the last sort of substantive area we talk about in the book, and it's something that could be a whole talk in itself really, is the whole issue of community policing and night patrols. And very briefly, they have an interesting history because they started out completely under the radar in the 1970s, where you had volunteers in communities with elders, either in the absence of police, there were no police, or the police that were there were not approaching things in a suitable way. They decided to do their own policing. But they got no funding. Very few people were aware this was happening. But in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in the 1990, they suddenly, and particularly the Tennant Creek, the Jalalakari night patrol, got a spotlight on it because the Royal Commission said, here is a better way of policing alcohol. And so they became a model. They were replicated all around the country, usually with inadequate funding. And then, to cut a long story very short, in 2007, as part of the Commonwealth intervention, the Commonwealth government came in and said, right, every community in the Northern Territory will have a night patrol. Fine. And it's got to be up and running by, 31st of December or something. So suddenly, it was all very well for the communities that did have patrols, but a whole lot of other communities were suddenly told they're going to have patrols. But at the same time, the Commonwealth said, now we're going to fund them all from the Attorney General's Department, and this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. And basically what happened, yes, they got more resource, but the level of community involvement just fell away. So there's an important cautionary story there for governments in particular, and that is, yes, you can support things, but if you try and exercise too much control, you actually kill it off.
R2 leaving base, heading out to Yokala.
Emily and Martin from the Community Patrol drive the streets until just after midnight around the very small and remote Indigenous communities of Yirrkala and Gooniyangara. A weekly basketball competition has just wrapped up.
Emma, you're finished, boys.
All done.
Some of the kids are hanging around, so the patrol offers them a ride home.
Are you going home?
I build trust with the kids so that when something big happened, they would come up and tell me about whatever the issue was.
Anyone else going?
Their job description is broad. It includes driving kids home, transferring vulnerable people to safe places, and referring locals to clinics or hospitals.
because you get a lot of outsiders coming in and out. It's just basically keeping them safe.
As we have a few Yolngu staff, we seem to have a better connection with the people in our communities.
If I know their family member, I usually get in, but if it's way out of my league, I usually leave it for the police. We go and we try and calm them down, talk to them.
We're not there to babysit them. We're not there to teach them what they should and should not do. We are there to keep them safe from being harmed or doing harm to others.
Mundaka Marika, who manages the land and sea on behalf of the Yolngu people, would like to see the patrol become more security focused and be permanently based in Yirrkala.
When there's the big fight in the centre of Yirrkala or on the other villages, where are they when we need them?
A service was once run by local women.
We could see them doing things, stopping and helping families, more involved in the community.
An Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report found community patrols can substantially reduce the number of admissions to police lockups in some communities. Community collaboration in Nhulunbuy has resulted in a 40% reduction in crime across the board.
The biggest issue we've got in this area is alcohol. By far it's our biggest driver of crime. And that's not only drinking on premises, but that's also secondary supply and alcohol going back into the homes and back into our stations.
Here in East Arnhem, locals must apply for a permit to take away alcohol.
You want to go shelter?
I'm not drunk. You drunk or what?
So we're a 6-bed facility, male and female, minimise harm risk in the community.
And if they drink too much, they can sleep it off here at the Sobering Up shelter.
The shelter's just overnight. I think we need to have respite and something where, you know, people have a chance to try and get off alcohol. If you live in a very disadvantaged place, you're most likely going to drink, smoke, take drugs.
Eddie Mulholland from MeWatch Health says empowering and employing local Yolngu people will help close the gap.
Believe it or not, we still have apartheid in remote areas.
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of points where, I'd quite like to just draw attention to about that, on that little clip about the patrols. One is the competing expectations. One of the points that comes very much out of our book is that there's been a tension between the people who run these patrols, who see them as a way of both preventing and resolving conflicts and increasing the safety of people, and other authorities who just see them as a cheap way of getting drunks off the street. And that has led to all sorts of problems around Australia, or a taxi service to the Sobering Up shelter. So there are these very different understandings of what patrols are trying to achieve. There was a little bit in that, although I suspect some things might have been edited out of it, because certainly when I was last in Nhulunbuy, there was some bitterness I detected, but because there they said, and I think in the clip it talks, one of the women says, yes, well, we started this patrol, but then it became taken over and placed with the regional council. And again, the sort of the sense of local ownership was diminished, was reduced. And these are themes that are going on all over the country. So, yeah. But Peter wanted us to go back and talk about that circle over on the right-hand side is taken from a project in New South Wales where they sat down initially with one treatment program and essentially sort of co-developed. We had a group of researchers, you had the service providers, and I think also there were clients involved in trying to develop a framework which would work for that place, but also a framework that could work elsewhere. And it's kind of captured in that they talked about, if you look at the outer circle, where there were these three domains, the staff skills, the governance issues, and links with other services. So they said that these are three dimensions which, however you address them, need to be addressed in some form. at the core of the program, according to this, is this notion of healing through culture and country. And then in terms of implementing that is the idea of these 6 key dimensions. The therapeutic activities themselves, case management, life skills, time out, sort of underestimated but important, and the aftercare support. So they said these are the 6 areas that and it wasn't so much saying what you do in these 6 areas, but you need to have a systematic approach that addresses. If you don't cover each of these 6 areas, you've got a gap in the program. So that, I think, is probably the most promising that we're aware of approach to, as I say, combine both that sort of notion of culture and healing that comes very much out of things like the Weali program with a more, if you like, mainstream idea of program effectiveness. Does anyone want to comment on that? Well, I think in a way you've tapped into what's one of the biggest issues in all of this, and that is that, you know, people don't walk into the, well, first of all, people don't necessarily walk into these programs. Often they're actually directed in through, you know, the criminal justice system. So you've got that whole issue of voluntary admissions with mandated admissions. And they don't just walk in with a grog problem. They're obviously walking in with a huge range of, or in many cases, a huge range of associated issues, which, you know, just hinted some of them, the housing, the, you know, problems with Centrelink and so forth. And I'm certainly not aware of any one model that kind of gets you across all of those. And as I interpret it, that's where the links with other services is an absolutely critical part, because no one agency is going to be able to address all of those. Yeah. I don't know whether anyone would claim to have found, you know, I mean, the other thing though I think we have to be a little bit careful of is, this is okay, this is a personal kind of view here, but I think we have a tendency to overestimate the power of models. One of the things that occurred to me a while back when I was looking at different, and bear in mind, I'm not a service provider, you know, I don't have the coalface experience that a lot of you guys have. But it occurred to me that governments are always looking for models because they want to feel that their funding is going into something that will work. So it's, you know, very natural. So the moment they see something working somewhere, they'll think, oh, we could use this as a model and, you know, we'll fund it somewhere else. But what occurred to me was that it's usually not the model that's the key thing. The key thing is, one, the involvement of the community, but the other one is the relationships underpinning a particular program. I would argue that the common thing through successful programs is relationships both between, if you like, Aboriginal people involved, but in particular across between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, so that you've got this kind of foundation of trusting relationships. And if those relationships are there, it's almost the model will kind of grow. But if they're not there, no amount of trying to find the perfect model will actually work, because that what's a perfect model in one place won't for that. And I think, you know, that we need to be pushing the idea of the relationships of the driver rather than the model. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we found that a lot. So my background is in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and it really is about, I suppose, reorienting that the Western dynamic of, you know, client and professional, because it tends, in all spaces, I see it always tends to take a more like a parent-child relationship rather than a partnership. And as soon as you have that, you are undermining the skills of the other person, the lived experience. You're invalidating that other person in the relationship, and you're removing purpose and control as well, which is fundamental to any sort of recovery. So I think that is critical. But again, as Kylie said, it's really hard to quantify that, to measure that, which is why I always have a rant, probably more correctly about it, around what is evidence. You know, evidence for our people isn't on paper. We only started to get into university systems in the 1960s, you know, and that's my parents' generation. So it's not how we store evidence. Our evidence is always in our minds, and it's typically governed by more spiritual things. So, you know, and how that knowledge is translated to, you know, our young ones and to others is through oral. But of course that's not sufficient for the Western ways of understanding evidence and determining what is evidence, and then going through a review for other people to say, yes, that's worthy evidence, that's not worthy evidence. So it's, yeah, it leaves a lot to be decided, and in our next presentation, we sort of go through a little bit of that around how we captured our knowledge, our way, to inform, you know, the best way we can move forward in all assessments, and whether it be FASD or cancer treatments, etc. But I think that's a beautiful point, and I think people are understanding that more and more, because if you make it accessible to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, these things, you make it accessible to everyone. And I think we're starting to learn the value of Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing, and that's there's a lot of hope there.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It reminded me of some years ago when I had to evaluate, or was part of it, the number I was evaluating a program called the Grog Mob in Alice Springs. It was one of these, you know, inadequately funded and inadequate time. But one of the issues there was this kind of tension between a number of individuals who were insisting that the sort of early intervention would take the form of cognitive behaviour therapy. This was seen as being the, you know, as a bit of a flavour of the month. But the person actually who was employed to carry out this had a very different approach, which involved first and foremost building a relationship. You take the time, you sit down, you just talk with the person, and there was this frustration with the you know, one fairly strong-willed and well-placed person who was insisting on evidence-based cognitive behaviour therapy, and this other person saying, no, neither that nor anything else is going to work until, you know, unless we actually establish the relationships. I think the other point, of course, is time. You know, the time, having demonstrated how to completely mess up time, but I mean, again, I've seen again and again that you know, the Western model, or the particularly government, you know, with all these strict timetables, we want this by 3 months, 6 months, keep performance indicators and so forth. Whereas if you take this relationship building approach, it's however long it takes. You know, you can't rush this stuff.
And that's where advocacy has to happen at that systems level, because our mob, particularly our workforce, do 10 times. Like, we're not just, you know, an Aboriginal health worker, we're also the cousin, we're also the cultural support, we're also, you know, and so it's, you know, even in research papers, N doesn't equal 1, you know, like it's, you know, and we're missing out so much of the richness, so much of the work. There is so much more layers to what our people do that is not being captured, and therefore the evidence doesn't exist. And and it's relationship based. So it's not this 20-minute, and that's where the trust and that's where the yarning comes in. This is how our people, you know, support people. Cup bushels goes. That should be just a fundamental KPI. I think if we saw the power of bushels, I'll tell you. There's a question.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really interesting point because I suppose not so much in my research, although I have seen it there, but more in, just from my own experience being out in the field and different communities, because I think I had to sort of, in a sense, learn this the hard way. I mean, I'd be with a number of people in one community thinking I could be helpful by saying, well, over in such and such a community, they tried this. And that's our sort of framework. Again, it's coming back to this idea of models that, you can generalise. We have, our culture, to the extent that it's a scientific culture in a sort of small s, if you like, is that we're always looking to generalise from the particular to the general. So if something seems to be good here, well, yeah. Whereas for myself, I came to realise that, well, it might seem to me obvious that if what works in this particular community has a good chance of working in that because there are similarities, and yes, there are similarities, but of course there are also important differences. And I think that working through that, how you get around this, because on the other hand, you don't want, and I don't think even people in Aboriginal communities want, every community to make its own, reinvent all the wheels that do and don't go round. So there are pathways to kind of learn from each other, but it's not a simple matter. And I think trying to work collaboratively as to how you identify points that you can adapt or modify or learn and generalise, and how you can't, is a sort of slow process. That's all I don't have any sort of answers on that, but I think we need to be aware that it's a much less straightforward process than we might think. Can I just make one last? Yeah, but the book will be available as a free. Everyone has to buy it. No, it's free. It'll be available as a free download. I mean, there will be copies around. I'm not sure what sort of price, but the main medium of getting it out is actually as a free download. So it should be out in the next couple of months.